Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this special Williamsburg Battlefield Association program. We're so glad that you're here. My name is Allison Woodard. I am the president of the WBA. A week from today is 4th of July and the 250th anniversary birthday of our nation. There will certainly be celebrations all throughout the historic Triangle and all over our nation. There's sure to be readings of the Declaration of Independence, and rightly so. Many consider that document to be our birth certificate of our nation, and one of the most significant historical documents in the founding of our country, along with our U.S. Constitution. Now, if you're a member of the WBA or a longtime follower or supporter, you know that our organization's mission is to tell the Civil War history of Williamsburg. And there's another very significant historical document that was issued during the Civil War, and that was the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the proclamation was issued at a time when our young nation was divided over the issue of slavery, and northern and southern states were at war with each other. Then U.S. President Abraham Lincoln issued the proclamation, which freed enslaved blacks in southern areas that were in rebellion, but it also redefined the purpose of the war from national reunification to a national rebirth. Lincoln presented the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet in July of 1862, following events here during the Peninsula Campaign that spring and summer. A wide cast of characters acted both consciously and unconsciously to convince Lincoln and many Northerners who were opposed to slavery, but not necessarily abolitionists, that emancipation was a military necessity if the Union was going to win the war. And nobody knows this story better than our guest speaker today, Glenn David Brasher. Glenn is a native of Birmingham, Alabama. He got his PhD from the University of Alabama and now is a history instructor there. But he's no stranger to the peninsula. He worked as a seasonal park ranger for 8 years at the Richmond National Battlefield. He gave tours of many of the historic sites associated with the Peninsula Campaign. But he has also taught at VCU. So again, he's no stranger to our area. Oh, at VCU? Yeah. Okay, I did not know that. So in 2013, he received the Wiley-Silver Award from the Center for Civil War Research at the University of Mississippi for his publication, The Peninsula Campaign and the Necessity of Emancipation. Glenn's presentation today will analyze the pivotal window between two Independence Days, July 4th, 1861, and July 4th, 1862, and reveal Lincoln's understanding of our founding fathers' intentions and the specific military pressures that forced a pragmatic president to become the great emancipator. Lincoln held lifelong anti-slavery views, but those views radically transformed during the first year of the Civil War. Please welcome Glenn David Brasher.
Can everybody hear me? Yes. Great. When Don contacted me about doing this presentation, the very first thing, and he'll testify to the truth of this, the very first thing I asked him, this was by email, is I won't have to put on a coat and tie, will I? Because I said, I don't like to put on a coat and tie normally, but especially not in the summer. And he said, if you wore a coat and tie with this crowd, you'd be out of place. I'm glad to see that he was right. I'm glad you all look very comfortable as I do. And then the other thing is I started thinking about what I would present on, and I came up with three things. In the summertime at the University of Alabama, I teach a class on Abraham Lincoln. The entire summer, that's what we do, is we examine Abraham Lincoln. Love doing that. So I knew that in the middle of the summer, I would be really absorbed with Lincoln at that point in time. And then I knew, the 250th of our independence was coming up. So I knew I wanted to tie it some way to the 4th of July and the Founding Fathers. And then, of course, you know, we're in Williamsburg, so I needed to talk about the Battle of Williamsburg. So I put those three things together, and the common thread between them is the institution of slavery. And I came up with this little presentation for you. By the way, this is the proper use of artificial intelligence here is creating images like this. I'm as scared of artificial intelligence as anybody is, but when you use it as a tool, it can really do cool things like this, and you'll see some of the other things that I've got in there. But let's get started. You can't know how proper your introduction was to everything I'm going to talk about. I was glad you brought up the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, all of it, because that's the heart of what I'm about to talk about, so that was perfect. Although born in Kentucky, slave state of Kentucky, in 1809, Abraham Lincoln seems to have inherited a disdain for slavery from his family. His father, Thomas, was descended from a Virginia family. I don't think a lot of people know that, which is ironic in some ways. But his father was descended from a Virginia family that apparently had Pennsylvania Quaker roots. And of course, I'm sure many of you know that the Quakers were the first organization to openly oppose the institution of slavery. Though Abe's relationship with his father was notoriously a very difficult relationship, to say the best, he inherited from him a strong work ethic, a gift for storytelling. Lincoln's speaking ability came from his father, but also an objection to slavery. As a small farmer, Thomas loathed the power that large slaveholders wielded in Kentucky, which more than once pushed him off of his own land claims. So, to escape slaveholders and disputed land titles, Thomas moved his family to the new free state of Indiana in 1816 when Abraham was just 7 years old. Is this too loud? Maybe need to turn it down a little bit. Is everybody okay? In Indiana, land titles were secure because they had been surveyed under the federal provisions of the Northwest Ordinance. In Kentucky, it was a little bit more, helter-skelter in the land titles, but they were very settled in Indiana. Thomas settled the family on a 160-acre farm where Abe spent the next 14 of his formative years. The forested environment was one that required a lot of back-breaking labor, which Abraham very dutifully performed for his father, but he hated it. He loathed every minute of it. And it was largely, not because he was lazy, he certainly wasn't lazy, it's because the strenuous work left him little time for his growing passion for reading. Books were scarce on the frontier, but the mostly self-educated boy devoured all he could find, as literature gave him an escape from the provincial life and hard work of the farm, expanding his world. That's a little better, thank you. Abe's thirst for knowledge was encouraged by his mother, Nancy, who died tragically when he was just 9, and then later by his stepmother, Sarah. Books like Pilgrim's Progress, Robinson Crusoe, Aesop's Fables, all ignited his young imagination. But one of the most significant cornerstones of his education was Mason Weems's biography of George Washington. Oh, I should have already popped to that, I'm sorry. So now I got to go to this. I'm a little behind. Of course, that book, Mason Weems's biography of George Washington, of course, that book is filled with a lot of inaccuracies and fabrications, creating a lot of the myths and legends surrounding George Washington, including the very famous cherry tree story. I'm sure you all know the cherry tree story. It came from Mason Weems's biography of Washington. Those kinds of stories were intended to promote a lot of virtue and honesty into young children. But for Lincoln, the biggest takeaway from that book was that he found himself wondering what drove Washington and his men and his army to endure the harsh conditions that they went through during the Revolutionary War and the repeated losses of the Revolutionary War, and yet stayed together until the end. And Lincoln was convinced, as a young boy, that they must have been dedicated to a principle greater than simply independence from Britain. For him, the answer was in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which he first read during his latter teen years. Quote, "No oppressed people," Lincoln later remarked, "will fight and endure as our fathers did without the promise of something better than a mere change of government." He concluded that this promise was the enlightened principle of liberty to all. inherent in Jefferson's self-evident truth that all men are created equal. This conviction fostered Lincoln's opposition to slavery, which was further shaped by two events in his early manhood, or two experiences in his early manhood. First, as he grew stronger, grew older, his father began to hire him out as labor to other farmers, and then his father would pocket all of the wages, giving Abe none of them, and Abe, I think rightfully so, viewed that as theft of his own labor. Second, were two journeys he took down the Mississippi River to New Orleans working on a flatboat crew. There, Abraham witnessed families being torn apart at slave auctions and shackled for transport on the river. Though he wrote nothing about it at the time, later he recounted those sights and said that they remained a source of, quote, torment for him his entire life. By that time, Thomas had moved his family to Illinois. But in 1831, Abe settled on his own in the river town of New Salem, Illinois, when he was just 22. So he struck out and got away from his father. There in New Salem, he pursued a whole bunch of different occupations that took him away from the farm work that he hated so much. Among other things, he was a store clerk there. He was a store owner. He was a land surveyor. He was a postmaster. Throughout, he continually self-educated through extensive reading. This is about the time that he started to read law as well. And his dynamic storytelling ability, which, as I said, he got from his father, his wrestling prowess, which he also got from his father, and his affable personality, which he also got from his father, cultivated a circle of very devoted friends. Having such good friends, he decided that, maybe they would help him to get into office, and so he turned to politics, embracing the policies of the Whig Party because of their platform of transportation improvements and economic expansion to create a diversified amount of American jobs away from farm work, which is perfect for him considering that he hated farm work so much. So he was drawn to the Whig Party, and his popularity, particularly in New Salem, got him elected to the Illinois State House of Representatives in 1834 at just 25 years old, if you can imagine. Lincoln wound up serving 4 terms in the State House, during which he was focused primarily on economic issues. Slavery wasn't even really something that anybody, particularly politicians, talked about. So he was in his early career, it was all about economic issues. But this period of time did give him a chance to first publicly release his anti-slavery sentiments. Disturbed by the rising abolitionist movement, the Illinois legislature condemned these organizations in 1837. They actually issued an official proclamation condemning the abolitionist movement. And while Lincoln voted for the resolution, he and a colleague insisted on entering a formal protest of the resolution into the record. In the protest, he agreed that the abolitionists were dangerous radicals, and he acknowledged that the Constitution did not give the U.S. government the ability to end slavery in the southern states. Yet he nonetheless declared slavery, quote, an injustice founded on, quote, bad policy. That slavery was legally untouchable by the federal government where it already existed, yet that it was also morally wrong, became cornerstones of Lincoln's political stance on slavery that we're going to see he held for much the rest of his life. In 1846, at just 38 years old, Lincoln was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, taking his seat in 1847. The Mexican War dominated his 2-year term, offering another opportunity to add to his anti-slavery platform. Maintaining that the federal government could not end slavery where it already existed, Lincoln aligned himself with the Free Soilers, as they called themselves, in the conviction that the U.S. government could and should prevent slavery's expansion into the new territories. He supported the failed Wilmot Proviso, a measure that would have prevented slavery in any territory conquered during the war. However, it was his outspoken criticism of the Mexican War that drew the most attention to the young politician. In a very blunt speech to Congress, Lincoln challenged President Polk's dishonest rationale for the conflict, declaring that the lying president should be ashamed to occupy the same office once held by the virtuous George Washington. Very strong language for a one-term congressman to get up there and say. Because the war's outcomes were popular with the American people, this speech derailed Lincoln's political career. Despite dutifully campaigning for the 1848 Whig presidential candidate, war hero Zach Taylor, ironic, Lincoln failed to secure any of the patronage positions he sought from the new administration. Maybe not so ironic. Consequently, he returned to the Springfield, Illinois legal practice he and a partner had established during his time in the state legislature. So at that point, it looked like that he was settling into his legal career in Illinois. Yet, very famously, he was drawn back into political action in 1854 by the repeal of the Missouri Compromise line, a consequence of Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act and his embrace of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty was the idea that people who actually moved into those territories should decide for themselves whether they wanted to have slavery there or not. It shouldn't be up to Congress. Let the people that actually moved to those territories decide whether they wanted slavery or not. Lincoln's longtime rival, Stephen Douglas, the one that passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was indifferent about slavery, could have cared less. But the repercussions were profound. The legislation opened close to 500,000 square miles for the potential expansion of slavery into territory that the Missouri Compromise line had established as slave-free. This really upset Lincoln, and very famously, this is when he decided to get back into politics. Formulating an argument against the legislation, Lincoln spent countless hours in the library, and I'm sure that a lot of you folks can relate to doing research in the library for countless hours, right? While he was there, he examined Southern pro-slavery polemics. That many of these pro-slavery writers denied that the Declaration of Independence asserted the equality of all mankind was disturbing to Abraham, but more infuriating to him were those who dismissed Jefferson's proclamation as, quote, a self-evident lie. To Lincoln, this was blasphemy that he hated, quote, because it enables the enemies of free institutions to taunt us as hypocrites. Further, he said, I object because it assumes it can be moral for one man to enslave another. Determined to bring the Founding Fathers into the fight, Lincoln deeply researched their sentiments about slavery, culminating in his first fully formed, historically supported argument against the expansion of slavery. He revealed his research in one of the longest speeches of his life, holding a Peoria, Illinois audience captive for 3 hours. Now, aren't you glad that Don and Allison only gave me 50 minutes? Right? Lincoln argued that the founders created a union fundamentally devoted to liberty and universal rights for all men. Yet, it harbored a serious flaw, slavery. He insisted the fathers knew the institution was contrary to the enlightened ideals of the Revolution, yet hoped that those very same ideals would eventually end slavery. To support this contention, Lincoln emphasized that the Declaration of Independence purposely began with Jefferson's statement about mankind's equality and that all are given God-given rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For Lincoln, those ideals established the very essence of the United States and its role in the world. He later drove the point home in another address, asserting, quote, all honor to Jefferson, who during the struggle for this nation's independence enshrined an abstract truth applicable to all men and at all times. That included African Americans, a sentiment Jefferson tried to include in the Declaration, conveniently blaming slavery on Britain by listing it as one of the Crown's violations of natural rights. Now that was kind of sneaky on Jefferson's part, but it showed what he believed, though. The Continental Congress dropped that assertion from the final version of the document, however, finding the omission of that condemnation of slavery necessary to maintain the North-South unity that was needed during the Revolution. Likewise, Abe argued that the founders viewed the existence of slavery in the South also as a temporary necessity. Now, every time he wrote in his notes for that speech the word necessity, he wrote it in bold and underlined it. So I want you to try to get the point he was making about necessity and get that word necessity drilled into your head the way that he intended to try to drill it into people's head when he gave the speech. So he said it was a temporary necessity to hold the Union together, as ending it would immediately cause economic turmoil and divide the new republic. He compared this to a man with cancer being unwilling to immediately cut it out of his body with a knife, lest he bleed to death. Nevertheless, he insisted, the founders took deliberate steps to restrict slavery's expansion, hoping that by confining it to the South, it would eventually wither away. Even before the Constitution, for example, Abe pointed out, they limited its expansion with the Northwest Ordinance. Now, Jefferson had wanted all the land west of the Appalachian Mountains to be slave-free, but because of the necessity of compromise, Congress was only able to prevent its expansion into the area north of the Ohio River, which, of course, was the reason Lincoln himself had grown up in two free states, Indiana and Illinois, but also why Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin were all free states. Millions of people, Lincoln asserted in his speech, were living on free soil, quote, as Jefferson had foresaw and as Jefferson had intended, end quote. Lincoln acknowledged the Constitution did provide concessions to slaveholders. A fugitive slave clause, the 3/5 clause of the Constitution that allows slaveholders to count 60% of their slaves for purposes of representation in Congress, a 20-year ban on the end of the African slave trade. But Abe insisted these were all matters of necessity to secure Southern support for the Constitution. Yet, revealing their real intentions, he argued, the founders purposely refused to so much as mention the word slavery or slave in the Constitution. Instead, they used euphemisms such as, quote, persons held to service, or, quote, such persons. Lincoln implied that they did so with foresight, ensuring that once slavery was finally eradicated, our founding document would be unsullied by the inclusion of the odious institution. As further evidence of founder intent, Lincoln listed several laws in the 1790s and early 1800s that in one form or another put restrictions on the expansion of slavery. Most especially, he pointed out that in 1808, at the very first moment they could, they ended the African slave trade. Why cut off slavery's lifeblood if they had not intended to kill it? Lincoln asked. Quote, thus we see, Lincoln insisted, the plain, unmistakable spirit of that revolutionary age was hostility to slavery and toleration of it only by necessity. His conclusion was straightforward. The founders knew that slavery was an immoral institution incompatible with the nation's founding creeds, and thus they placed the repugnant institution on a path toward elimination. In 1820, Lincoln continued, leaders further restricted slavery's spread by creating the Missouri Compromise line and its ban of slavery north of the 3630 parallel. In removing that line, Lincoln said, Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act was a profound departure from the founders' intentions. Still, he understood that national unity and the law required the government to respect the legal protection of slavery in the southern states. All he wanted, Lincoln insisted, was to restore the Missouri Compromise line, placing slavery back on a path to elimination as the founders had intended. Now, as compelling as the speech was, an objective assessment, right, reveals significant negatives and weaknesses. Lincoln explicitly disavowed support for black citizenship rights beyond just life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, voting rights, access to courts, that sort of stuff. He rejected the idea that African Americans should have those rights, just life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Further, while conceding he did not know what a widely accepted plan for emancipation would even look like, he embraced colonization. That's a plan that involved freeing the enslaved people, but then deporting them out of the United States to some place in Central America, maybe in South America, maybe in Africa. Now, he embraced colonization for much of his life, and he did so largely because Jefferson did, as well as Abe's political hero, Whig Party leader Henry Clay. Perhaps most egregious to us historians, Abe's history was cherry-picked, as we say. He overlooked the more nuanced and often contradictory views of the founders, including Jefferson and Patrick Henry's failures to ever do anything about slavery in Virginia, or even just to free the people they enslaved, despite both admitting that the institution was immoral. Lastly, Lincoln essentially erased those founders who passionately defended the institution of slavery, which of course required the compromise that he said was necessary to keep the Union together. Despite such weaknesses, however, and they are very significant, the speech was nevertheless a sturdy anti-slavery argument, the premise of which is supported to a degree by the later in life words and actions of the founders. Jefferson, Hamilton, Franklin, John Adams all publicly condemned the institution. Franklin served as president of the early nation's most active abolitionist organization, while Jefferson publicly labeled slavery as, quote, an evil and, quote, an injustice for which he feared God's punishment. Washington eventually admitted slavery was, quote, a subject of regret for him, and in his will he did something that even the sage of Monticello never did, and that is he freed the enslaved people he owned at Mount Vernon upon his and Martha's deaths, declaring their freedom to be something for which, quote, he earnestly wished. Thus, Lincoln echoed Jefferson, calling slavery, quote, a monstrous injustice. That's pretty strong words. Restoring the Missouri Compromise line's restrictions on slavery's expansion would, he said, quote, return it to the position our fathers gave it, and there let it rest in peace. In other words, let it die. For the next 7 years, Lincoln repeated this stance in his most famous speeches, continuing to conjure the founders to bolster his case and frequently introducing new elements to his argument. For example, during the 1858 Illinois Senate race, Lincoln sparred with Stephen Douglas over the founders' true intentions. In their famous debates, Douglas challenged Lincoln's already famous assertion that the nation could not survive half slave and half free, arguing that the founders were the ones that created it that way. Why can't we keep it the way they created it? He provocatively asked Lincoln on stage. Further, Douglas insisted the founders meant only white people were created equal, arguing, and I think he's actually got a good point here, arguing that had they intended to champion the equality of all men, the slaveholders among them would have been honor-bound to immediately liberate their slaves, a step none of them took. Lastly, he insisted popular sovereignty, which remember was the idea that people that lived in the territory should be able to decide for themselves whether they wanted to decide with slavery or not. Popular sovereignty, he said, was Jeffersonian democracy in action. Lincoln countered. The founders did not create a nation half slave and half free. They inherited it, he said, leaving slavery as it was, quote, because they knew of no way to get rid of it at that time. Further, he insisted Jefferson did intend to proclaim equality for all in the Declaration, citing his first draft's criticism of slavery and the fear Jefferson revealed in his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, that God would one day punish the nation for the hypocrisy of slavery. As for democracy, and this is a great Lincoln line, as for democracy, Lincoln said, quote, when a man governs himself, that's self-government. But when he enslaves another man, that's despotism. I think that's a mic drop moment. Then, using the same points as in his Peoria speech, Lincoln argued that Douglas mischaracterized the founders. Abe said they were the wisest and best men of the world that recognized slavery as an evil and limited its expansion. Unlike such good men, and Lincoln emphasized good, unlike such good men, Douglas didn't care if it expanded because he didn't see it as wrong. Quote, that's the real issue, Lincoln pinpointed, the eternal issue of right and wrong. Another mic drop. Although Lincoln lost that 1858 Senate race, his anti-slavery career had just begun. Over the next 2 years, he refined, published, and repeatedly delivered elements of his Peoria speech, gaining attention from the newly formed Republican Party. Seeking a more moderate presidential nominee than frontrunner New York Senator William Seward, who was a perceived radical on the slave issue, party leaders invited Lincoln to speak at New York's prestigious Cooper Institute in February of 1860. Lincoln gladly accepted, using the platform to introduce compelling new elements to his argument. Conjuring the founders to his side yet again, and how you like my image of him, again, proper use of artificial intelligence there, I think. Conjuring the founders to his side yet again, Lincoln reiterated that they purposely omitted the word slavery from the Constitution, but now he argued that this had a deeper significance than just the omission of the term. Because they never used the word slave, Abe argued the Constitution's framers did not expressly or even implicitly define enslaved individuals as property. Instead, they referred to, in those euphemisms, as persons, thus recognizing their humanity. This argument directly countered slaveholder insistence that the Constitution implicitly defined slaves as protected property that they should be allowed to carry anywhere they wanted to. Further, Lincoln crunched some numbers. Of the Constitution's 39 signers, 21 had voted to restrict the expansion of slavery in some form, mostly with the Northwest Ordinance. 3 others who did not have the opportunity to vote on the ordinance, Franklin, Gouverneur Morris, and Hamilton, were nonetheless active opponents of the institution. Lincoln concluded that 24 of the Constitution's signers thus opposed the expansion of slavery, and that, he said, constituted, quote, a clear majority. Now, Lincoln was mistaken about 2 of those 24, but he corrected the error in a published version of the speech. How many politicians would come back and admit that they got something wrong and publicly publish that, hey, I screwed that up? But anyway, he came back and he published a retraction, but then he further strengthened his argument by adding a quote from a private letter Washington wrote later in his life. These are Washington's words, quote, "There's not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." Thus, far from being radical, Lincoln argued, those that oppose slavery's expansion are actually conservative, simply wanting to limit the expansion of slavery as the founders had done. The dangerous radicals, Abe compellingly insisted, were the slaveholders who were breaking with the path of the founders, labeling slavery a positive good rather than evil that should be allowed to expand. The Cooper Institute speech helped Lincoln secure the Republican nomination, subsequently winning the general election by earning electoral votes from every free state. His victory caused the secession, as we know, of several Deep South states as they feared Lincoln's clear animosity towards slavery. I love the way James Oakes, in his book Freedom National, puts it, that the South, far from sort of being reactionary when they seceded, were just taking Abraham Lincoln at his word, that he had made it clear that he hated the institution of slavery. Consequently, he began to more heavily emphasize his longstanding belief that, like the founders, he could not touch slavery where it existed. In a letter to his old congressional friend, Alexander Stephens from Georgia, soon to be the Confederate vice president, Lincoln guaranteed that his administration would not attempt to end slavery in the southern states, insisting, quote, the South would be in no more danger in this respect than it was in the days of Washington. Such assurances failed to halt secession, of course, and the formation of the Confederacy, as 7 states left even before Lincoln's inauguration. Traveling from Springfield to Washington, Lincoln again conjured the founders at 2 historic locations. In Trenton, New Jersey, the site of Washington's first major battlefield victory, Lincoln recalled that as a child reading Weems's Washington biography, he realized the Continental Army fought for the greater cause of liberty for all mankind. Then at Philadelphia's Independence Hall, he declared that he never held a political belief, quote, that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence, adding that the document offered, quote, hope of liberty not alone to the people of this country, but to the world for all future time. Still, on the eve of a possible war, Lincoln carefully coupled these sentiments with his belief that while the government restricted slavery's expansion, it could not touch it in the southern states. In his inaugural address, for example, he insisted the government had no right, he said, to interfere with slavery in the South, even voicing support for an amendment explicitly stating this limitation. He believed the Constitution already did that anyway. So he said, if y'all want to amend the Constitution to explicitly say it, then do it. Famously, in his final plea for unity, he invoked the founders yet again, expressing hope that the united spirit of the Revolution, quote, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell again the chorus of union. And of course, you know the rest of that famous quote. Sadly, that unity didn't occur with the war starting at Fort Sumter in April of 1861. By July 4th, 1861, the Confederacy included 11 states, had moved its capital to Richmond. Anybody that's ever been to Montgomery, Alabama can tell you why they wanted to get out of Montgomery, but I always crack that joke. Well, I was about to say something about Richmond, but I'll leave it alone. So they had moved the capital to,
Be careful now.
Yeah, exactly. Right. They had moved the capital to Richmond, and the U.S. military had begun moving into Virginia. On that Independence Day, Lincoln convened a special session of Congress to deliver a written address. And you can't tell me that he didn't purposely choose that day in particular for that congressional meeting. During that address, he reaffirmed the positions he voiced during his inaugural address. Fitting for the holiday, Lincoln invoked the Declaration of Independence yet again, but now to take a swipe at the Confederacy. Alluding to the ordinances of secession that each rebel state had issued, Abe said, quote, our adversaries have adopted their own declarations of independence, in which, unlike the good old one, penned by Jefferson, they omit the words, all men are created equal. Why? He rhetorically asked. Why this pressing out of the rights of men? Conversely, he pointed out the Union supporters were fighting to maintain that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the conditions of men. These words again showed his belief that the founders championed the equality of all mankind, and yet, near his conclusion, he yet again affirmed that the government could not abolish slavery in the South. Thus, on the 4th of July, 1861, Lincoln reasserted beliefs he had held most of his life. Further, he had spent the previous decade publicly insisting the Founding Fathers shared those convictions. Yet just 1 year later, as America celebrated its 86th Independence Day, Lincoln was prepared to move against slavery in most of the southern states. Why? 17 days after that first 4th of July of the war, the conflict escalated when rebel troops routed the U.S. Army at Manassas. Following that northern disaster, newspapers highlighted that slave-built fortifications had impeded the Army's advance, contributing to the defeat. The public soon learned the Confederacy was extensively utilizing enslaved populations to construct fortifications all over the southern states, not just in northern Virginia. Throughout the fall of 1861, abolitionists tapped into the anger that was ignited by this forced slave service to the Confederacy, arguing that beyond any moral imperative, emancipation was, quote, a military necessity justified by constitutionally granted war powers. They insisted that liberating enslaved people would not only weaken the South, but also add that vital strength to the U.S. military. These arguments were not entirely new. Roughly 25 years earlier, John Quincy Adams, son of a founding father, argued hypothetically that the event of war would grant the government the constitutional authority to seize slave property. More recent, even before Manassas, General Benjamin Butler famously refused to return enslaved freedom seekers who had been forced to labor on southern fortifications at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. I'm sure you all know that story of Fort Monroe. Reasoning he could hold on to them as, quote, contraband of war, a policy that Lincoln approved. By the end of 1861, abolitionists and radicals in Congress increasingly pressured the president to adopt this policy more broadly, bringing significant attention to what came to be known as the military necessity argument. Still, most Northerners remained confident that 21 million Yankees could defeat 9 million Southerners, even if the Confederacy were using its enslaved population in military roles. Lincoln's December 1861 address to Congress showed that he also was not prepared to accept the military necessity argument. Furthermore, Lincoln had placed George B. McClellan in command of the Army of the Potomac. Any boos at this point? No? Had placed George B. McClellan in command of the Army of the Potomac, an officer who firmly rejected emancipation even as a military necessity. McClellan eventually, now those of you that know that story know I'm using the word eventually kind of carefully there. Took a long time, but eventually planned a campaign to capture Richmond, opting to avoid a direct march from Washington due to the formidable Southern defenses in Northern Virginia. Instead, in late March 1862, he used the Potomac River and the U.S. Navy's control of the Chesapeake Bay to bypass those defenses, landing his forces southeast of Richmond on the Virginia Peninsula. Okay, now here's the part of the story where you guys know the story better than me, right? Although McClellan had sufficient forces to advance, progress quickly stalled due to poor roads and bad weather. The Army also encountered defensive lines across the peninsula that Confederate General John B. Magruder had spent months overseeing. These incorporated the Warwick River and connected to Yorktown's old Revolutionary siege lines, which the Confederacy refashioned for their own purposes. I think a lot of people, when they go to the Yorktown battlefield, you guys all know this, but I think a lot of people that go to visit Yorktown and look at all those trenches and say, oh, look what's left over from the Revolutionary War, don't realize that those are basically left over from the Civil War. Right? But anyway, they were refashioned for the South's purposes. Enslaved laborers taken from farms around Williamsburg, Yorktown, and as far away as Richmond and Petersburg did most of the work. Facing these obstacles, McClellan decided on siege operations, which he was very confident in his ability to carry out a siege. The Yorktown siege lasted a month, during which the Confederates shifted troops from Northern Virginia to Yorktown, strengthening their defenses. Northern newspapers reported the Army's delay in front of the slave-built entrenchments that allowed the rebels to improve their fortifications. Yankees soldiers watched as enslaved men continually worked on Confederate trenches and improved them, and it frustrated them. Soon appearing in Congress, these complaints began to help to promote the military necessity argument. Congress was working on they had already passed one so-called Confiscation Act, which legalized Benjamin Butler's policy. But now they were debating a new version which would allow commanders to take slaves from all rebels, not just rebels that were using them to build construct fortifications. But the debates over that second Confiscation Act promoted the military necessity argument. For example, Republican Representative John Hickman of Pennsylvania argued, quote, "Does not every man see that when the Confederates are at liberty to employ their slaves in the erection of fortifications," and he was referring to Yorktown, "it is a matter of necessity to deprive them of these auxiliaries." Soon, McClellan brought up heavy siege guns to bombard the Confederate fortifications, but freedom-seeking blacks came into Union lines warning the rebels were leaving. On May 4, soldiers confirmed these reports as they advanced into the rebel works without firing a shot. The Confederates had left, believing they could more effectively resist the U.S. advance if they fell back closer to Richmond. That's a debatable point. I'm sure you guys probably debate that a lot in your meetings. As the U.S. Army took over Yorktown, soldiers curiously examined the earthworks that had stalled their advance for a month, expressing stun that the rebels would leave such impressively constructed and formidable works. While most soldiers focused on the Confederates who had gotten away, at least one Yankee saw something more. George Townsend, a correspondent traveling with the Army, remarked, quote, "The fine works at Yorktown are the monuments to Negro labor." I think that needs to be on a sign out there. As the rebels retreated, the poor roads slowed their movement up the peninsula, and Confederate General Joe Johnston was forced to send General James Longstreet back to Williamsburg to hold off the Union advance. Longstreet set up a defense east of Williamsburg, placing men in a series of forts that covered the convergence of two roads from the lower peninsula. Upon the arrival of U.S. troops, as many as 16 black men in the area, likely from the Whitaker farm, which I understand we're sitting right on top of right now, right, informed Union commanders that the rebels failed to maintain certain entrenchments on their left. Some of them knew of a hidden route directly to those abandoned positions. Late that day, as Union attacks on the Confederate center stalled, Winfield Scott Hancock's brigade followed their guidance and discovered the redoubt was indeed abandoned exactly as the slaves told them that they were. Although Hancock could not secure approval for an attack on the rebel flank, Longstreet eventually recognized the threat, dispatching Jubal Early's men to drive Hancock away. Because the Union men were in occupied positions within the abandoned Confederate entrenchments, they easily held their ground. Then, when disjointed Confederates attacked, they faltered. At that point, Hancock ordered a countercharge that routed the enemy's forces, resulting in the Army of the Potomac's capture of the first rebel flag of the Civil War. The military intelligence provided by the Peninsula's enslaved community made this success possible. But ironically, so did the very redoubt the Confederates had forced the black men to construct. Following the Battle of Williamsburg, Johnston continued his retreat towards Richmond. Northern newspapers celebrated the Williamsburg battle as a victory, praising how information from enslaved Virginians was benefiting the Union cause. For example, as blacks provided road directions and corrected faulty maps, the New York Times noted, quote, "Our armies have hardly taken a step on the Virginia Peninsula without reliance upon the reports of the black community, whose accuracy has been remarkable." Congressional radicals continued to use such reports to press Lincoln to embrace the military necessity of emancipation. However, the U.S. Army's advance on the peninsula, alongside consistent military progress in other parts of the South, made the military necessity argument appear questionable at best at that moment. As U.S. forces advanced on nearly all fronts, the Confederates in Virginia appear to be falling back to their last ditch outside of Richmond. At the end of May, Lincoln publicly declared that as commander-in-chief, he and he alone had the authority to decide whether it was a, quote, necessity to act against slavery in the seceded states. In his judgment, that time had not arrived. But now on the outskirts of Richmond, McClellan's army faced even more formidable rebel entrenchments and had to construct their own. Laboring in the unrelenting heat and humidity. Now, I always think about those Yankees coming down here that first summer of the war and really figuring out what humidity is, right? The unrelenting heat and humidity. U.S. soldiers bitterly noted that as at Yorktown, enslaved Virginians had built the rebel trenches around Richmond, sparing Confederate soldiers of the work. They were also aware that enslaved blacks had proven more than willing to work for the U.S. Army in any capacity. The entire time they were coming up the peninsula, the enslaved community was coming out and meeting them on roads and bringing them buckets of milk and Johnny cakes, as they called them, and saying, you know, whatever you want us to do, we'll do it, right? So they knew that the enslaved community was willing to help. And so through their letters home, as well as newspaper reports, Northerners learned of this situation and complained. For example, the Chicago Tribune pointed out, quote, "Thousands and thousands of black men are anxious to aid our army in making entrenchments. And yet, while every division of the army is suffering from the hard labor on the fortifications, Lincoln and the government still has done nothing to offer freedom to the enslaved." Pressure on the president came from other sources as well. On June 20th, for example, a delegation of Quakers visited Lincoln to encourage him to use his constitutionally granted war powers to free the slaves as a military necessity. The president gently rebuffed the group, saying he was not even sure that a presidential decree of emancipation could be effective. Around this time, Confederate Joe Johnston was wounded and replaced by Robert E. Lee. And of course, in the Park Service, we always joke that that was the best shot fired for the Confederacy, the one that wounded Joe Johnston, right? The aggressive new Southern commander decided to depend on his largely slave-built fortifications to keep Richmond secure, while most of his forces would strike at the right flank of the U.S. Army. The results of that attack, which started on June 25th, would soon decide the fate of McClellan's campaign. As Lee prepared, black Virginians came to Union lines, insisting the rebels were about to attack the Union right. Thus, when rebels did attack, U.S. troops were prepared, stubbornly holding ground at Mechanicsville, at a place just outside of Mechanicsville called Beaver Dam Creek, as well as Gaines Mill. However, Lee's attack unhinged McClellan, and that's being mild on McClellan to say that he was unhinged. There's worse things I could say, right? They unhinged McClellan. The timid commander decided to get his army to the safety of U.S. gunboats on the James River. The rest of what came to be known as the 7 Days Battles involved McClellan trying to reach the James and Lee trying to intercept him. The battles culminated on July 1st at Malvern Hill, where Federal artillery repulsed aggressive rebel frontal attacks. On that very same day, July 1st, Lincoln's old friend, Senator Orville Hickman Browning of Illinois, came to the White House to talk to Abe. Browning's diary that he wrote that very night emphatically indicates that Lincoln agreed with him on that day, again July 1st, 1862, that Lincoln agreed with him on that day that the government had no ability to touch slavery in the South, expressing the difficulty of caring for the thousands of runaways that were already behind Union lines. Clearly, Lincoln was not ready to move against slavery in the seceded states. Meanwhile, after holding off savage Confederate attacks at Malvern Hill, the U.S. Army spent the next few days scrambling for safety. Local blacks helped yet again, helping the soldiers make sense out of the twisted and confusing roads down to Harrison's Landing on the James, which I'm sure you guys know is Berkeley Plantation. Collapsing there from exhaustion, the men were protected by the powerful guns of the U.S. Navy. As they hastily settled in, the military began shipping many of its wounded back to Washington. Independence Day, 1862, was somber in the U.S. Capitol. Although the results of the fighting were still unclear, a stream of wounded soldiers started arriving. Lincoln spent most of that holiday in the War Department deciphering mixed telegraph messages from the Peninsula, trying to figure out just exactly what was going on. At some point that day, he was visited by Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, who encouraged Lincoln to mark the nation's independence. He told him it would be a perfect day to do it, 4th of July, by declaring an emancipation decree. The president responded by indicating he was unsure of how the Army would feel about it. On his way home, Lincoln fell in with a wagon train of sick and wounded men who were moving towards hospitals. Now, I say he was on the way home. He was actually on his way out to the soldiers' home. I'm sure many of you know that in Washington there's the soldiers' retirement home. And Lincoln and his family had decided that it was much more comfortable in the summer to go out there because they had better breezes. So when I say he was going home to the soldiers' home. The president, who frequently enjoyed conversing with common soldiers, inquisitively gathered the sentiments of the Army. Again, another good use of AI up there. There's no record, and I'll be honest, there's no record of what the men told him that day. But in their early July letters and diaries, U.S. soldiers repeatedly commented on the worn-down, dispirited, and physically fatigued condition of the Army of the Potomac. If you read any soldier diaries and letters and you see them dated beginning of July, in the Army of Potomac, you're going to see them complaining about this. Furthermore, the soldiers were angry, believing the rebels had attacked with such energy because the South utilized enslaved labor to build entrenchments, sparing Confederate soldiers the physically exhausting work details that plagued the U.S. troops. Undoubtedly, there's no doubt in my mind about this, Those complaints made it directly into Lincoln's ears on that 4th of July. And soon, these sentiments were published in newspapers. The Indianapolis Journal, for example, printed a letter from one Hoosier soldier decrying the fact that they had been worn down digging fortifications, yet, quote, "The rebels use their slaves for these purposes, why should not we?" The editors agreed. There's neither justice nor mercy in not using willing black laborers on the entrenchments so that our men may have the rest and comfort they so much need. This is the opinion of soldiers everywhere and in every rank. And so again, I have no doubt that Lincoln heard all of that as he talked to those soldiers. Politicians also began to push the argument, and now it was not just the radicals. One example was New York's conservative Republican political boss Thurlow Weed. Quote, "I want to strike while the iron is hot," he proclaimed in a widely published editorial. "If the government had only emancipated the slaves when the war started, at least 500,000 of slaves who have been at work in the rebel armies would have been helping us, thus weakening the enemy and strengthening ourselves in corresponding degree." Repeating Weed's letter, the Washington Chronicle added, "There's no resisting an argument such as this." But while Republican congressmen continually pointed out that slaves had been used on the South's fortifications, they also argued that the dependable aid blacks had given the Army in the form of military intelligence ought to be rewarded with freedom, and that if they offered that freedom, they could expand the amount of help they were getting from African Americans. Ohio conservative Senator John Sherman, yes, brother of the military officer, told Congress, quote, "The question must now be decided whether blacks shall be employed only to aid the rebels." He then wrote his brother, quote, "You can form no conception of the change of opinion here as to the Negro question. Men of all parties, meaning political parties, now agree that we must seek their aid and make it the interest of the Negroes to help us." But what about the president? As we have seen, on July 1st, Lincoln insisted he could not touch slavery in the South. But things started to change after that July 4th experience with the soldiers. Just 3 days later, Lincoln traveled to Harrison's Landing, again Berkeley Plantation, spending 2 days visiting the Army and its commander. Aware of what was going through the president's mind, McClellan handed him a letter encouraging Lincoln not to move against slavery in the South. Previously, as we have seen, Abe would have agreed. This time he said nothing, mulling over the issue on the ship ride back to Washington. And now, there's some AI in that image of him on the ship there. The romantic in me wants to believe that on that ship ride back, and he was thinking these issues over, that he thought back to that flatboat trip that he took to New Orleans when he was a teenager and saw slaves shackled, and said that it was a torment to him the rest of his life. I've got no way of proving that, right? But I like to think that's what he was thinking on his way home that night. 3 days after returning, Lincoln was riding in a carriage with Cabinet Secretaries Gideon Welles and William Seward. According to Welles, the president suddenly blurted out, quote, "He had about come to the conclusion that it was a military necessity, absolutely essential for the salvation of the Union, that we must free the slaves or ourselves be subdued." Welles maintained that Lincoln said this was the first time he had mentioned it to anybody. As we've seen, Lincoln had long desired to rid the country of slavery, but only by stopping its expansion. He held firm to this position until as late as July 4th, 1862, but now, barely 2 weeks after the failed Peninsula Campaign, he was intent on a new course to win the war. Welles indicated that Lincoln added, quote, "Slaves are undeniably an element of strength to the South because thousands of them are in attendance upon their armies in the field, and the fortifications and entrenchments are constructed by them." Lincoln concluded, quote, "We must decide whether that element should be with us or against us." The president had something revolutionary, and I use that pun intended, in mind. On July 2nd, he informed his full cabinet of his intention to release the Emancipation Proclamation, going beyond Congress's new Confiscation Act by declaring freedom to all enslaved persons in seceded states, whether their masters were rebels or not. However, Seward convinced Lincoln not to do it until after a battlefield victory, so it would not appear as a desperate act. Lincoln agreed, with that victory not coming until September of 1862 at Antietam. Yet Lincoln had firmly established his desire to do it well before Antietam. Only Seward's advice changed that. I like to stress that because a lot of times in popular culture, when people try to tie battlefield to emancipation, it's always Antietam, and it shouldn't be, right? It should be the Peninsula Campaign. Among other reasons, Lincoln's commitment to not use the federal government to touch slavery in the seceded states changed because of events on the Virginia Peninsula and the actions of its African American community. Those things convinced Lincoln that emancipation was, quote, a military necessity to win the war. Influenced by his interpretation of the founders, much of his political life he worked to stop the spread of slavery, but considered the maintenance of slavery in the South as, quote, a necessity to keep the Union together. Yet now he came to believe that it was a military necessity to destroy slavery in the South to preserve that very same Union. And just as John Quincy Adams insisted 25 years earlier, the war itself gave him the constitutional ability to do it as a war power. Once this became evident, Abe's lifelong moral objections to slavery meant he embraced his decision with his whole heart. In fact, Lincoln seemed to believe that God had worked out the military events in the favor of the enslaved. Folks, I firmly believe that right now we are sitting on sacred ground. Here, enslaved Virginians did two things that played a role in shaping Lincoln's mind. They were forced to build the entrenchments impeding the U.S. Army, but they also provided a census crucial to the Army's success. Of course, this is not the only spot where such things occurred. What happened here is just a mere drop in the bucket. But it's the well-documented convergence of both those things here on the same ground that make this place unique. And when I say well-documented, I don't just mean the paperwork. I mean readout number 11, which is still out there beautifully preserved. To my knowledge, there's no other spot of land anywhere for this kind of site-specific interpretation of this aspect of emancipation. There should not be another Sheets or apartment complex or retail development of any kind anywhere near this place. I think y'all agree with that, right? There should be a great big monument, and I mean that with my whole heart. There should be a huge monument out there. Such a memorial would be fittingly placed, nestled here closely to a town that shaped many of the founders, contains the Capitol building where Burgesses first asked the Continental Congress to declare independence, and is neighbor to the battlefield on which Washington's army won it. All those things inspired Abraham Lincoln his whole life, and then he was motivated and inspired by black Virginians who were seeking their God-given rights, and so should we all. Thank you.
I think there was a message there to me.
Huh?
This is Doug Olerud.
Oh.
All right, I'm the district supervisor.
Yes, there was a message definitely to you. In fact, Don told me last night that you were going to be here, and I said, good, because I got a great line at the end that I wanted him to hear. Good.
We have a few minutes if there's any questions.
Two questions. What was Lincoln's relationship with the abolitionists? And number two, why was Lincoln so sure that the South would give up slavery on its own if time presented?
Well, I think to answer the first one first, I mean the second one first, I think that he was, what's the word I'm looking for? Being way too optimistic on that. And it wasn't until, because one aspect that I didn't talk about in this lecture is that the whole time that these events that we've been talking about here were going on, he was trying to get the border states to accept gradual emancipation even with the federal government paying them, paying them, compensating them for them, and he couldn't get the border states to even budge on this. Not even Delaware, that had 100 slaves, he couldn't get them to give up their slaves. And I think it was at that point that when he realized I can't even get the border states to do this, particularly Delaware, that he realized he had miscalculated, that nothing is going to get them to let go of these slaves. And I think that's another thing that played a role in why he decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. But that's all another story. So I think he just miscalculated it to some degree. And who knows why? I mean, that's where what your question is asking me is why. It may have to do with the fact that he came from Kentucky. His father came from Kentucky. They became anti-slavery. So maybe he felt like that anti-slavery sentiment was a little bit more in the South than we've been led to believe. He certainly miscalculated at the start of the war, thinking that a lot of people who didn't own slaves, which is 75% of the white population in the South, would actually come out and support the Union, and that didn't happen. So just one big, huge misunderstanding of the Southern mindset, I think. And then the other part of your question is his relationship to the abolitionist. Well, he always believed the abolitionists were dangerous radicals because they were asking the government to do something that constitutionally they couldn't do, and that was to end slavery in the South. So he felt like that they were pushing for something unconstitutional, where their energy should be in trying to promote compensated emancipation. So he sort of considered them to be dangerous radicals. And then, of course, in the first 2 years, well, really throughout the entire war, but particularly the first 2 years of the war, they were the source of the biggest pressure on him to do more than he had done. So he never embraced them, and they never really embraced him until the very last, right? Until he comes out in the fall of '64 pushing for the 13th Amendment of the Constitution to free the slaves. By the way, think of the irony of that. In his inaugural address, he said if y'all wanted to amend the Constitution to say that the federal government can't touch slavery where it already exists, that would have been the 13th Amendment, and then it turns out the 13th Amendment actually freed the slaves. But so yeah, he and the abolitionists didn't see eye to eye with each other until that point. Does that answer your question?
I know you probably don't like this, but a what-if question.
Okay.
What if Joe Johnston wasn't shot, and he stayed as leader of the Confederacy, and McClellan actually captured Richmond in June of '62? Would that have changed the calculations and as a result, the rebellion collapsed?
Yeah. Don and I actually talked about this a little bit yesterday, and that's a big what-if question that gets asked a lot. And it's, unlike most what-if questions, I think that's an important one.
Would Lincoln he would not have the justification then?
Exactly. So if the city of Richmond gets captured in 1862 as a result of McClellan's campaign, given everything that was going on in the rest of the South, as I alluded to in the speech, I think you're right. The rebellion's probably over. It probably ends at that point. And if it ends at that point, slavery's intact.
Right.
Right?
Absolutely.
It's starting to fall apart. It's starting to crumble on the ground. But overwhelmingly, most enslaved people are still on the plantations at that point in time. So the war ends with slavery intact. And then I think Lincoln goes back to his original plan, which was to try to stop it from expanding, and hopefully it's going to wither and die away. Now, he always famously said, I have no idea how long that will take. It could take as much as a century, right? And, of course, it took us a century to get rid of Jim Crow law, so, he was probably right about that. But, yeah, that's a very important question because, yes, I think slavery survives the war. But that goes back to what I said in my speech, that Lincoln believed that God had controlled events and that things worked out, whether you believe in fate or God or destiny, things worked out in favor of the enslaved community. That's something that he wholeheartedly believed in and basically made that clear in his second inaugural address.
Could you then make the argument that Robert E. Lee was a divine instrument
of... I actually wrote an article basically making that argument. It's online. You should look at it. It's what role did Robert E. Lee play in freeing the slaves, or something like that,
absolutely.
where I basically make the argument that they're saying that it's ironic that Robert E. Lee's successes turns the war into a war for emancipation.
Right.
Yeah, so I think we're in agreement on that. Any others?
Just at this point in time, did that match Lincoln's mentality? Because originally he was very much into colonization.
Yeah.
To Liberia and other places.
Right.
But by this point, would you say, had he, I guess with discussions with Frederick Douglass and others, had he said, no, that's really not quite right? At some point he appears to have changed his mind.
Yeah, and exactly when that moment is tough to figure out, because he's even after he's decides to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in late July of '62, that summer, I'm sure you probably know this, he had a meeting with African American leaders in Washington, D.C., meaning clergy in Washington, D.C., where he was still pushing colonization. And at that point in time, it hadn't been publicly made known yet, but he was already thinking about the Emancipation Proclamation, so he was still pushing colonization at that point. If you've ever read about this meeting, this is one of Lincoln's worst moments. He's very aggressive and basically blaming the war on blacks, their existence here in this country, and basically saying, look, when it's over with, you guys need to get out of here. And even to go to George Washington, he even compared, he said, I know this would be a sacrifice for you to do this, but it's no bigger than the sacrifice George Washington had to make to win the Revolutionary War. I mean, if you can believe it, it was just terrible stuff. So he was still ardently supporting colonization even after he had publicly issued or had made the decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. You don't hear him mention it in the final version of the Emancipation Proclamation in January of '63. So there's a lot of historians who argue he's dropped it by January of '63. I think that's too early. I think he holds on to it all the way until late '64, and the reason why he eventually decides to drop it is because, once again, of the activities of the African American community. He was really, in some ways, blown away by how many blacks served in the USCTs, U.S. colored troops, and how well they and how passionately they had served. And if you know anything about Lincoln, you know that had a transformative effect on his thinking about African Americans and citizenship rights. I'm a big believer that by the end of his life, and he says some things in his last speech, gets him killed, but he says some things in his last speech where he's talking about we need to think about citizenship rights for African Americans, at the very least those that have served in the military. And he always contrasted their devoted service to the Union to draft dodgers and the so-called Copperheads that were fighting against the Union war effort in the North, and said, look at these black people who don't have citizenship rights, and look what they're doing to serve their country, versus some of these people who are citizens of this country are unwilling to fight for the Union. And so, to me, that changes his mind about citizenship rights for African Americans, and that includes he finally drops colonization. So if you're asking me to put a date on it, I would say by the end of '64 is when he finally drops it. But I'm not even sure that he doesn't still have some sense of it even into '65, to be completely honest with you. It was an idea that he firmly believed in and believed in his entire life. And as we all know, sometimes it's difficult to let go of things that we have believed our entire life, despite evidence to the contrary.
Just a follow-up
Yeah.
to that. Well, one of the quotes I remember, I guess I think in talking to Frederick Douglass, on that issue, he rather prophetically said there are people that will not want you, the colored, the black race, to succeed.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Probably a big part of his colonization mentality.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you know a little bit about this. You know that eventually what he centered on was a plan to move him to a place in Central America called Chiriquoy or something like that. I don't know how it's pronounced, because there were some coal mines there that he believed that they could go and make a living in these coal mines. Now, I don't think that would really improve in their life very much, but he really had centered on that, and again, he doesn't really let go of it. And, you know, you're bringing Frederick Douglass in there. Frederick Douglass plays a huge role in that. Because, and this is something I argue with or talk to my students about in my Abraham Lincoln class. His entire life before he became president, he had never really encountered very well-spoken, well-educated African Americans. There were only, you know, a handful that lived in Springfield, Illinois, where, you know, he lived most of his life, and they were things like barbers and so forth. And so I think a lot of his opinions of African Americans changed when he started meeting gentlemen like Frederick Douglass and started realizing that, hey, these people can be educated and can learn just as well as anybody can. So I'm glad you brought up Frederick Douglass, because he plays more of a role in his changing opinion than we might think, just because meeting such an intelligent man of color. And Douglass was just one of many, by the way. Go ahead.
Can I give you a follow-up on that? Did Lincoln fundamentally believe or thought that perhaps the races could not live together? Is that?
He made that very clear. Now, there's some debate over whether he was making that clear because he knew that politically that's what people wanted to hear, or if he actually truly believed it. But he made it clear pretty much his entire life, most especially in the debates with Douglass, that he did not believe that African Americans had the same citizenship rights as whites did. He believed that they had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as in the Declaration of Independence, as I talked about. But as far as citizenship rights, most of his life he denied that. Again, whether he was denying it because he was trying to get elected or he truly believed that, that's questionable. I think, if you're asking me my personal opinion, I think he truly believes that. It's the reason why he embraces colonization. But again, to go back to Douglass and his changing ideas on colonization, he's different by the end of his life, right? By the end of his life, and again, I think the USCTs play a large role in this. He's someone who's willing to accept that African Americans deserve to be citizens of this country. They deserve the citizenship rights of this country. It's because of how well they served this country, a country that denied them, even citizenship rights, the Dred Scott decision. He was a totally different man by the end of his life. That's one of the problems with when people talk about Abraham Lincoln. You can find quotes, solid, historically rooted quotes of him saying pretty odious things. African Americans shouldn't be citizens of this country. I don't think they should be citizens, blah, blah, blah. But then you can find him saying other things later in life. So whenever you hear a historian make an argument that Abraham Lincoln was a racist, that never wanted to see slaves freed and he only did it because of military necessity and blah, 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 you have to ask them, okay, when did he say what you're quoting here? Was it during the Lincoln-Douglas debates or was it at the end of his life? Because he's changed, right? And again, go back, Frederick Douglass plays a large role in that. So.
Here's another what-if question.
Okay.
Take away the Civil War completely. And if cooler heads prevailed, both North and South.
Do you believe cooler heads could have prevailed?
If that were the case. I know that slavery ended in England and other places around the world along this time, and we've got industrialization coming along.
Yep.
But setting the Civil War aside and rational thought on the part of everyone.
How long would it have taken?
Slavery have ended naturally?
Well, like I said a few minutes ago, Lincoln always, because that's how he wanted it to end, right? And he said, I don't know how long, it could take 100 years. To me, and Richmond, Virginia is a perfect example of this. Slavery was adaptable to industrialization. And like I said, Richmond is a perfect example of that. There were a lot of enslaved people working in the industries in Richmond, as I'm sure you know.
Tredegar Anderson said that it cost more to utilize slaves than free labor. It cost him more to utilize the slaves that he's renting than to use the free labor that he had.
But that's because he was renting, though, right? What if he owns, right? Think about the fact that prior to minimum wage laws and so forth, we were talking about the Gilded Age, right? Think about how labor was exploited in the industrial environment, even the northern states.
Well, he had to feed him, he had to maintain him, he had to provide living spaces for him. That's what cost him more.
Yeah, but if you're paying them wages, you don't have to do all of that, right? So my point is that if you can get away with exploiting labor one way or the other, you're going to exploit labor one way or the other. I don't want to sound like an anti-capitalist. I'm not a red. Don't anybody get any afraid. But I think we could debate this, and certainly, as you're very well aware, this is a very big debate among historians whether slavery was adaptable to industrialization or not. I think it was. So I think it survives into the 20th century. And again, we don't give up Jim Crow until the 1950s and 1960s. I think we give up slavery before that, but I still think it makes it into the 20th century.
Well, I've tried to find references by people back from 1850 beyond up to 1900 of people espousing the demise of slavery through natural processes. I can't find it. I can't see that anywhere in what I've read.
Yeah, and you hear, I'm sure you pro-Confederate people all the time say, "Oh, slavery was on the way out." Well, as I'm sure you're very well aware, slavery was never more profitable than it was in 1859, 1860, right? It was turned out more profits than ever. So it was alive and well and thriving. Again, I think it survives at least 50 to 60 years. Into the 20th century.
Well, that's my guess too.
But let's say it survives. Let's say it survives to 1910, 1920. We might be getting rid of Jim Crow, right? If we say we get rid of slavery in 1865 and then we don't get rid of Jim Crow until 1965, 100 years, let's say slavery lasts, we're still playing what if, slavery lasts until 1920, we may be just now getting rid of Jim Crow. It's terrifying to think about. Yes?
An incident that's connected with that, remember the Nat Turner Revolt.
Yeah.
And that prompted special sessions of Virginia Congress, and I think many other states were looking at what's Virginia going to come up with.
Yeah, and what did they come up with? More harsh slave codes.
Well, yeah, but after a while, they did consider.
They did talk about it, but
what do you call compensated emancipation?
Yeah, but it came to nothing.
Hard, it's too expensive, and we want to ship them back to Africa, and we don't have enough ships to keep up with the population, and.
Oh yeah, colonization was impractical, completely impractical.
And after a while, if you're like, this is too hard, let's just go home.
Yeah, for sure. But I'm glad you bring up Nat Turner. Nat Turner, that rebellion haunts white Southerners, and in my mind plays a role in why Lincoln had so much animosity towards him in 1860 in the South, because everything that white Southerners knew about him is that he hated slavery, and he had made that clear in the Dred Scott decision. And so in the debates with Douglas, and so they associated him with abolitionism, even though, as we just said, that he was never comfortable with the abolitionists. White Southerners associated with him with abolitionists, and in their minds, abolitionists were Nat Turners and John Browns. And so they were completely convinced that if Lincoln's in the White House, not only are we getting abolition, we're going to get hardcore John Brown, Nat Turner abolition, and that scared them to death. And like I said in my speech, just like John Oakes argues in Freedom National, they were just taking Abraham Lincoln at his word, and that scared them to death, and it scared them to death because of Turner, and it scared them to death because of John Brown. Now, am I defending secession? No, but I can see what they were thinking, what they were scared of.
Okay. Glenn is going to stay up here, so if you do have other questions that come up, please feel free.
Yeah, as Don found out last night, I love to talk. Well, and Don, I had just driven all the way up here by myself, so I was ready to talk. And I'm still ready to talk, so please.
But we'll just take a pause here. But again, please feel free to continue talking with Glenn. But we want to thank you so much, Glenn, for coming. We've been talking, I think, with Glenn for about 2 years to get him here. We're so glad that the stars finally aligned that you could come.
For the 250th.
It's the big. You didn't come just for us, okay? But in case you didn't know, and Glenn mentioned this during his speech about the Readout 11 and the information that 16 to 17 enslaved blacks gave to Union headquarters somewhere here on this property was instrumental in the fighting that occurred around Readout 11, which is on what we call the Egger track. And the research that Glenn did, it's in his book, Peninsula Campaign and the Necessity for Emancipation, was instrumental in helping to save and preserve that property, that 250 acres of the Egger track. So thank you very much.
You know, that tears me up to hear you say that, because I told Don this story last night. When I was at VCU, the topic for my book first emerged as a dissertation. And the slave historian there at the time period, his name is Phil Schwarz. If any of you have heard Dr. Philip Schwarz, he's dead now, unfortunately, God rest his soul. He was the first one to like my topic that turned into my book. And after reading the chapter that I had written on the Battle of Williamsburg, talking about the slaves and the information they supplied in Readout number 11, he offhandedly said to me, just offhandedly, because he knew I worked at the Park Service, wouldn't it be cool if one day you could find that ground that the slaves led them to and those trenches and get that preserved in the National Park Service? And I said, yeah, that'd be pretty cool. And then it turns out, you know, I discovered it like 5 or 6 years later that, oh my gosh, as you guys know, that fortification out there is so beautifully preserved and in such a special place. And so if my research played any role in helping to get that ground preserved, in a lot of ways I feel like my life has been worth it, to be honest.
Well, it was very helpful, and we thank you very much.
Thank you.
In reference to it, to the county, years ago.
That you just don't know how that touches my heart. So I'm about to cry. Because, I mean, as you can tell, I'm passionate about this. And like I said, no sheets. No retail development, anything. Big memorial, huge memorial to emancipation needs to be out there somewhere.
We got to make that fight again.
That's the reason why I'm talking about it.
But we want to give you this gift of appreciation from the Williamsburg Battlefield Association.
Thank you.
It is fragile, so I'll tell you what it is. It is a Virginia 250 commemorative glass flask.
Oh, wow.
Made by master glass blower Phil Gilson.
Wow.
He is a 5th generation glass blower and one of only 2 known master glass chippers left in the country.
Well, I'm not going to unwrap it now,
And
but
there's some information on him there in the bag.
It's a flask? Wow.
It's a flask. And these have been specifically made for Colonial Williamsburg for the 250th. So we'll hope that you'll cherish that as a gift from us.
Very much so. Very much so. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, we've got some birthday cake back there to celebrate the birthday of our country. Please feel free to help yourself to the cake. We've got some beverages. We've got some cookies. Again, please help yourself. We thank you so much for being here. And again, please feel free to continue conversations and the what-ifs with Glenn.
Yeah, I don't actually mind the what-ifs. Y'all all were so careful about asking me what-if questions. I don't mind those at all. When I worked at the Park Service, I would say 6 or 7 out of 10 people that came in the door wanted to talk about what-if questions. So I'm used to it. By the way, what did y'all think about the last artificially generated image there? I love that.
I gotta learn how to do that.
Yeah.